Railcar and
Well, not exactly professional media service.
proudly presents.
Hello, David in the shop here. Today I am going to talk about restoring the Adlake windows from a rail car. This will come in several different pieces because it takes several days to do a restoration. So I thought I'd start today by showing you not the disassembly, that's an entirely separate process, but what you have left after you've disassembled something and what you go about doing. So here are the two pieces of an Adlake window sash. They're made of aluminum. There's an extrusion, and then at the top here, right about here, I think they actually get welded at some point, because otherwise I have no idea how you could put them together. The challenge with these guys, as you can see, is they are a bit crufty. So they have gunk there, they have some more gunk here, and we want to get rid of that, and we also just want to make the window shiny. But here we have a real specific problem. This is one of the screws that holds the two parts of the frame together that was broken off, and getting the broken screws out of the frame is one of the painful things that a person has to do. And I will show you how I go about doing that. We'll try a couple of things, and if heat and some other things like that don't work, then we will just grind it down and drill it out. So the other thing we're doing here is we want to take the outside piece here, get some better light on this, get the outside piece on this and make it shiny. You can see that it's just dirty looking, and this is all what's facing your passengers, or at least the edge of it, so we want to clean that up. So there are a lot of ways you can take the cruft off of the aluminum. You can see here I have Scotch pads. They work pretty well, and they're the right idea, but doing all of the work you have to do by hand is slightly silly, I think. So you need to get something mechanical, and what I do is I just use my cordless drills, and here's some used items. These are the ones that I have found effective. I use this wheel, which is, and they come in grits. I think this was advertised as an 80 grit or something like that. 80 is about all that you want to do, because you do not want to be scratching the aluminum or actually removing metal. But I use this to get into some of the tough places like that and help me out. These brushes are not too bad. Again, they come in various grits. I think this one was an 80 before it got messed up. Here's a 180. They're relatively soft. They still leave the aluminum a little bit scratched, and they're not perfectly effective. The thing that I've found actually that works the best for me are these Norton discs, and these are I have both medium grit and very fine grit. The medium actually pulls up a lot of material, and it's about the right width to sit on the edge of the aluminum like that. And they do wear down. Here's one that was used for a different project and has served quite well and got the job done, but so these are, like all abrasives, they are expendable materials. So I will just start to work with my drills and polish up the aluminum. So let's talk about safety for a second. I am grinding things, right? So have our power tools. So you don't want to just do that. A couple of things I do. First of all, N95 dust mask is pretty important because you're going to be pulling up a lot of aluminum oxide plus the cruft that was on there. You don't want to be breathing that. I also, not really necessary in this case, but I also have some sound deadening earmuffs. They also give me Bluetooth sound so I can listen to some music while I do this work because it's a little tedious. The other thing is somewhere on the table, here they are some gloves, right? So these will not save you completely if something slips and the abrasive hits a hand somehow, but you will be very happy to have those on if that happens. And it's going to happen at some point, so you should be prepared for that. It'll also keep the stuff off your hands. And if you're doing this work, you are going to get dirty. You're going to get really dirty, and there's really no two ways about it. So be kind to yourself or your home or your partner's home or whatever, and don't go into the house and sit down on the nice white couch after you've been doing this work. That would be a bad choice. At any rate, that's kind of the quick safety briefing. I'll mention eye protection. I wear glasses all the time. And I am okay with that. If you don't wear glasses, you should have some kind of eye protection. I typically will wear additional eye protection if I'm underneath something looking up and there's likely to be stuff actually coming down. That's where I find I get stuff in my eyes. This will do quite well if something were to come off and fly. But this again is compared to grinding steel or reducing steel. This is very benign work, and so you should be a little bit careful and be conscious, but you don't have to go all out when you're doing this. Okay, kids, here's why you want to have a mask. The top one is a new one. The bottom one is the one I've been wearing for the last couple of hours while I cleaned up the aluminum. And yeah, you want that gray stuff on the outside of the mask and not on the inside of your lungs. Eh? One other quick bit about safety. Secure your work, right? So I have a couple of clamps here. I love these guys. They're very easy to use. And I'm just securing the frame to my work table so it doesn't move around. Not a big deal with this, but you're going to be much happier if you do this. And the way I have the frame on the table, I can just slide my roller chair around and get to almost all of the work without having to adjust. I'll move things to get to this back edge here, but other than that, this will pretty much, one setup will do it for me. Sometimes you come across some cruft that's really on there, and eventually the abrasive would take it off, but sometimes a flat razor blade can do a very good job of this. Now, you want to be careful that you don't scratch your aluminum, at least no worse than it's already scratched in other places, but when it gets tough like this, you just need to get out a tougher tool. So the question is, what was that stuff? I got it all off. You come down to the other corner, you see that it is the cork. See if I can get some light on it. The cork that is the vibration damper between this frame and the ring that retains it. And we'll get into that and how that all gets assembled, but this is a classic bit of the adhesive that kept this there, plus just the fact that it's pressed very, very hard, has left it. And you really have to get all this stuff off, because when you come back and try and put the sealer or the damper in, this will get in the way. So this has all got to come off. And either a chisel or a razor blade is probably the right tool for this part of the job. What you want to do is get in here and make sure you don't have any cruft in where the gasket is going, and because you want a good seal, or anything out here that's going to cause a problem with getting everything to sandwich together. Because what you have is this frame, the outer frame, the glass, a gasket, and some spacers, and it all has to sandwich together fairly perfectly. So I've got actually the easiest of the four surfaces that you have to clean up. You've got two sides of two pieces, right? So that's four. I did the easy one first, which from a self-psychological warfare perspective may not be the best choice, but that's what I did. So the one side's done. Now the other side here, I'll just have to turn the camera and get a better picture of it. The other side is not inherently more complicated. Well, it's more complicated. It's not more difficult. It just has a more interesting surface. Okay, so we've got the backside of the top piece sorted out, and cordless tools, right? So one of the things you have to keep an eye on is the charge on the battery. See, this guy only has one deal, and basically that means he's getting pretty low. You can also just tell because the motor runs slower. So you need to make sure that you have a way to recharge your batteries, because otherwise it's going to be a short work session. So I'll go plug this battery in and take one of my spares out and put that in the drill here. The other thing I want to look at is the flat side of the number 2 piece here. This is a critical piece because this is the piece which presses against the gasket that is on the actual opening in the car body itself. So if there is any way that water can worm its way behind that gasket and into the car, it will. Water has an amazing way of being able to get to any place that you make a mistake and let it get to. So there's a couple of problems with this piece which I'll need to deal with. One is that somebody at some point put some caulking on it, some silicone, and they were probably trying to address some leaks, but fundamentally what they're making up for is an old gasket that's no longer pliable. And when a gasket gets stiff, then you can get vibrations and the water will come past the gasket. So my suspicion is that's what they've done. The other reason somebody might be moved to use caulking or silicone is if the car body is not straight. If the car body comes down and makes wiggles like that, obviously it wouldn't be that big, but makes wiggles, then it's going to be really hard to seal. That really should be addressed by straightening the edge where the window sits up against the car body, not by caulking the heck out of it, because that's not a good long-term solution. And down the road, when somebody does the restoration better, like me, then they're going to have to deal with the silicone, and getting silicone off is a royal pain. It's going to involve razor blades and the abrasive wheels. And what I have found, I Googled it on the internet knows everything, is that you can use WD-40. Why that works, I'm not sure, but something about the oil and the water displacement characteristics of it help soften or gets the silicone to release its grip on the aluminum and lets it come up. Anyhow, there'll be quite a bit of work in messing around with getting the silicone to come off. Here it is. You can see the silicone there, and it's friable. You can pull some of it off with your fingers, but there's always a residual that you just can't really get up, and that's what the problem is. And you can just see that it's, in general, there's a lot of cruft here, and you want to just get this clean and flat and shiny on this side because it's what's up against the gasket. So that's what we'll begin to do. Okay, so we've got things cleaned up, and I used my CNC router basically as a milling machine, and very carefully drilled out the hole of the bolt that was broken off, and I've rethreaded that. So I'm using a flat bottom tap here, and you don't have to do every hole, but if you look in the holes with a good light, you'll see particularly the ones along what was the bottom of the window tend to have a lot of corrosion in it, oxidation, and you want to chase the threads with your tap to get rid of that corrosion as much as you can. So I'm just going along here. It's kind of time consuming, but it's worth doing because if there's corrosion in there, it kind of begets more corrosion and so on and so forth. So I'm looking in each hole. I'm only doing the ones that look like they have corrosion, but the ones along the bottom here, along here, all have a bit of aluminum oxide in it. So we're going to use the tap and get rid of that stuff. When you are chasing the threads in the holes, you want to be sure to use a bottom tap. What that means is that the end of the tap is more or less flat. In this picture, you see a regular tap and a bottoming tap. If you use a regular tap, you will hit the bottom of your material before you get your threads fully chased, and that's not a good idea. In this picture, we are looking at a good angle into one of the holes in the bottom sash, and what I'm trying to show you here is the light gray, almost white corrosion on the threads. And I'm seeing that by pointing a light into it at the right angle. A good set of threads is going to be pretty much shiny. Okay, so we have the frame all cleaned up, and now it's time to start assembling things. With these first pieces of glass, we had to take a little bit of material off the corner. We originally specified a radius of 3 inches, and that actually makes the glass come out a little too far. I'll show you a still picture of that. So we have ground down the glass to a radius of just a little bit less than 3.3 inches. And our experience says that goes into the frame with the gasket much, much better. So here's the gasket. Where's an end of it? There's the profile of it. So it holds the glass, and this is a single pane glass as opposed to the original dual pane. The dual pane, you had 2 slots and you had 2 smaller pieces of glass. And that's a little more difficult to work with, but gives you a little better insulation probably. Anyhow, I've got this piece here, and one of the key things is when this is not, you can see this end is not perfectly square. So that's kind of a problem, but it's the loose end, so that's no big deal. So it's important to get the end of the gasket really, really square. And you use a tool like this. You can see it's flat and a very sharp blade. And even with this, it's still hard to get it square both vertically and horizontally. So you may have to take a little bit. Using a blade doesn't really work really well unless you've got some kind of a guillotine set up, which you're not going to have unless you're in the shop. Anyhow, this tool works pretty well. So the other thing is that you want the joint in the gasket to not be at the top or the bottom. You want it to be on the side. That's where you're going to get the least problems with water coming in. And then you start clamping the gasket around the glass until you get back to here and find out how long you want it to be. Clamps like this are really, really helpful to keep it on the glass. Basically, if you don't do something like this, it's going to pop off the glass and you're going to get really frustrated. So at this point, I have the gasket tucked into the edge of the glass all the way around. and clamped until I get back here to the gap, and I'll show you what I'm going to do there. It's important to keep the gasket fairly tight at this point, because when we make this joint, we're going to leave some excess, and we're going to need some space to shove that excess back around, distribute it around the edge of the glass. The reason you want excess is that over the 7 to 10 year lifespan of this gasket, it is going to shrink. And if you cut it even, the force will pull it apart and you'll have a gap. If you force a little bit extra into the mix, then when the gasket shrinks, this joint does not pull apart. So I'm going to cut it about, probably 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch extra. Adlake used to say 3/8 of an inch. Other people say an inch or an inch and a half. I've been doing, 5/8, 3/4, something like that. That seems to be pretty good. And again, I give myself a little bit extra, so if I have to trim a bit to get a square, no big drama. Oh, one thing to note is that, notice I have the glass up away from the frame. By doing that, makes it much, much easier to put the edge of the glass into the gasket. If you try and do it with it laying on the frame, you can get it done, but it's quite a bit more of a pain. Okay, here's our joint, fairly close up, and some overlap. So you're just going to shove it in there, but of course not. You're gonna glue it. The gasket company says, I asked them, how they do it, and they said, well, we actually use a chemical that welds the rubber together, but if we told you, it would kill you. So they said, don't use what we use CA glue or super glue. And one of the tricks is to buy a grundle of these little itty bitty tubes, because super glue will dry out on you. If you're going to do a bunch of these in one day, which you're probably not, you could have a bigger container and it'd be fine. But I just get a bunch of these little guys, and I use the glue that I need. I think it's 1 gram of glue in here. It's not much. And then toss it away. One of the other things which I get from Alex is this Instaset, this CA glue accelerator, and that helps a lot, because rather than wait a minute or two for your glue to set up, you put your glue in, you make your joint, and then you spritz some of this in the vicinity. It's a chemical thing, and all it has to do is touch a little bit of the glue, and it'll ricochet through your whole joint, and it will set the glue in like almost instantly when you hit it with this. So the process is going to be, put a goodly amount of glue on the joint. You can just barely see the joint there. Stick it together outside like this, adjust it a little bit so everything's all aligned, and then spritz it with the accelerator, and that'll be pretty good. I don't worry too much about glue getting out of the joint. On the early ones I did, just come back with a good sharp knife or a razor and trim the excess off. You don't want a bunch of glue gooping around here or back here, where it's going to cause trouble when you try and get the clamping action of the frame on this gasket. Alrighty, so here is our finished joint. You can see I've got a little excess to trim off. Also note that I pushed the rubber, the gasket, onto the glass to get it aligned with the glass, and this means that I have probably glued my gasket to the glass, but I'm not really worried about that. It's not going anywhere for a long, long time. And after I get this slack here redistributed all around the frame, we'll start setting the glass down into the aluminum frame and work this excess around so it's like no big drama. All right, so we have the gasket into the lip of the frame all the way around. Getting there is a little bit of a tedious process. Basically, you are continuing to push the gasket onto the glass, so you can see it's kind of popping back there, and if it's doing that and it's not in the lip, you're going to have to push the gasket onto the glass to get it to drop in. And you just work around and shove on the glass, like shove it this way, shove it that way, and then you'll get to the point where it's mostly sitting where it needs to sit. The next step is to go ahead and put the top of the frame on and put all the shims in. Put the shims in all around, because there's a shim that goes here. Where's a piece of that? This isn't cut yet, but there's a shim that goes here, and then the top piece sits on top, and you screw all the way around, and that gives quite a bit of pressure on this gasket to squeeze the glass, makes it watertight, airtight, and other good stuff. So what I'm going to do now is cut these to length. So what I've done is I have a setup on my CNC router over there, and I'm making pieces that have the holes very precisely spaced and very precise from the edge. Note they're not actually in the center of this, but they need to go. You can see that the holes in the aluminum are not centered either, so they need to line up with those. So there are 4 edges, and then there are 4 corner pieces. Here's a corner piece. That's a bogus one. Here's a corner piece. It has 1 hole in it. It sits right there. So what I do is I place the corner pieces, and I just put screws into them to just hold everything in place. And then I come back and I measure the length that I want on the ends. And as it turns out, in Adlake's infinite wisdom, there are 2 different hole spacings. You can see I'm just holding this in position here so it doesn't go anywhere. There are 2 hole spacings. Yeah, so the 3 1/4 go along the verticals, and these along the edge here are in 3-inch centers. So a person needs to keep track of your stock, and you can see, clever boy that I am, I've marked all the stock. That actually says 3.25, and even if you can't really read it, it's very distinct from the single 3 that the 3-inch centers are. So I will go pin my corners in all 4 corners. I will measure these guys, cut them on a bandsaw. It's very useful to have a silver Sharpie to mark the black plastic with. And after I get all the pieces cut, I'll come back and show you how they lay out. Okay, so I have all the shim pieces cut, and they're laid out there. One thing I want to share with you, though, if you come down real close here, that hole's not lined up. To get it to line up, I'm going to have to push in, like so, against the gasket. And that's just because the gasket is a little bit loose and it's sitting on the glass there, but it can move around. So the lesson is that as we come back and put the retaining ring on the top of this, there's going to be a lot of fine adjustment that we have to do. So we want to tighten just a little bit and work along each edge. And there are going to be times when we might have to even get out a clamp and squeeze here a little bit. But there's plenty of room for the gasket, but sometimes it needs to be persuaded to go where we want it to go. So we'll take the retaining ring here and set it on. I've got to take the screws out of the corners, of course. And the corners are a decent place to start. Again, sorry, it's going to take two hands to do this, so I'm going to have to come back and show you some bits and pieces later. Before I get too far ahead of myself, all of the screws need to have anti-seize on them. And the question is, well, which one should I use? This is what I'm using. You want one that is specifically designed for aluminum and stainless steel. This, I think, is that, but its main advantage is that it's a stick and it in a paste, so it's much easier to deal with. You don't have a bucket with a brush in it and getting goop all over the place. So you can just twiddle this up like a chapstick and dip your screw into it, and away we go. So as we put the screws in, every single one needs to have anti-seize on it. You don't need a bunch, just enough. If you put a little tiny glop on the tip of the screw, when you put the screw in, it'll distribute it through all of its threads, and that's what you want. So don't overdo it. This stuff's expensive, but that's the plan. So anti-seize, screws, and one other thing is, one's tempted to use power tools. Please don't. I'm very, very tempted. I just have a screwdriver with the bit in it. The screws that I'm using have hex heads on them. The reason I'm doing that is to give myself a little better chance when I need to take them out in 8 or 10 years. And the other options basically are a slotted screw, which I really don't like. It's so easy to strip those out. A Phillips might be an option, except McMaster Carr does not sell this particular screw with a Phillips head on it right now for some reason. You can see it's got a beveled flat head, beveled, but the trick is it is 1 1/8 inch long, which is a very odd dimension, and you can't fudge it. If it's shorter, if it's an 1 inch screw, it won't grab. If it's a 1 1/4, it's too long and it won't tighten down. So it's got to be 1 1/8. And the dimensions, it's a number 8 by 32 thread. So 8/32 inch and 1/8, and least problematic drive that you want to use. I'm trying these hex heads. We'll find out in 5 or 10 years how I did. Okay, so I have the first screw in, one of 50 or some. I haven't counted them, but I had to jiggle the retaining ring and the gasket and the shim to get that to set in there. Now I've not tightened that at all. It's a Guten tight, but I haven't clamped anything down. Now I'll work along this edge, and hopefully by the time I get to this corner, it'll all just line up. It never does, but you just work on it. Be very gentle. Don't force anything. In particular, be really careful you don't cross thread your screws. Stainless is much harder than aluminum. It's totally possible to cross thread, which is why you use a manual tool, among other things. So just get it started by hand, make sure it's started correctly, and then gently screw it in. If it's right, it'll just go right in, and you'll know. Don't force anything. Okay, I've got my second screw in, which orients this shim and everything. I'm going to come about halfway down, put another one in, then try to come down the end. I think I'm okay here. Just by feel, everything seems to be copacetic. In particular, the frame is down touching the gasket, and everything, and it's touching on the bottom. So I think this is going to be kind of problem-free, but we'll see. Again, one in the middle, one on the end, and then I'll come back and just get all the intermediate screws here. Okay, I've got the one on the end in. This is the place where I showed you where the natural lay of the shim here was not in alignment with the hole. I had to put my thumb here and push in quite a bit. You can see there's quite a bit of lip here. That's okay. It's everything is well supported. The original shims are just a hair larger than 3/4 inch, so when you buy 3/4 inch stock, it's a little bit shy, but no big drama. But I did have to push this in against the gasket to get the thread started on this screw. That's very typical of what a person has to do. Okay, I have all the screws in this edge, and they're not really tightened down, but they're sort of tight. And I've got this guy started here on the corner, separate piece. That's good. And you can see that I don't have any gaposis along this edge, which is good. Also, note the clever implant of the window number. This happens to be window number 8, so it's upside down, but it says 2395 window 8. So it's good to add your own marks, but the guys in the factory did us a solid and marked everything. So now I'm going to go ahead and go down this line. Same drill, just get everything started and barely a little more than finger tight. I'm just going to work my way all the way around. You can see I'm popped up over there, so no big deal. We get there, we'll have a little bit of pushing and pulling to do. On this edge, interestingly enough, on this screw right here, I couldn't get this screw right here. I couldn't get everything lined up. What I wound up doing was taking all the screws out, pulling the shim out, enlarging the hole just a tiny bit, and then putting this one in first, and then coming back and re-entering all these other screws. That's fairly typical of the kind of stuff you have to do. All right, so I'd noted that that edge is a bit popped up, and so is this. So what I'm going to have to do here, rather than just work my way along this edge, I've got a screw as far as here. I'm going to have to figure out, do a little pushing and pulling here to figure out why this isn't sitting down. Basically, the gasket is not exactly where it needs to be. Again, not a huge drama. You just have to do a little pushing and pulling to get it to sit. This one, I believe, not sure you can see it down there, but it's not flush with the bottom. So it needs to get probably shoved in and then pushed down. So again, typical, lots of minor adjustments as you go along. The key thing is don't do too much all at once, and be careful about binding yourself up by putting something too tight here that doesn't too tight down here, so that you don't have enough slack here to make the adjustments you need to make. I know I promised a victory dance, but I don't dance, don't ask me. And anyhow, here's a still picture of the completed window. Everything's tightened down, everything's wonderful, and it is ready to be installed in the car once, big asterisk here, once we get the car body ready to take it. There's a lot of corrosion and old paint and things that we need to get out of the way before we actually go installing windows. But put your own happy dance in here. We've managed to get a window put together and ready to go.